This is Talking Rackheads. Hi, I'm Nigel from The Art of Sound, and this is episode 7 of Talking Rackheads. My, how time flies. I can't believe this is the 7th one of these that I've actually done. But anyway, yeah, I hope you're enjoying the series. And for those that didn't see the announcement I made in the Facebook VCV group, Talking Rackheads will now come out every 2 weeks instead of weekly during the summer period, simply because my workload at the studio increases with the good weather, and so I don't have the time to put together an episode on a weekly basis. But fear not, they will be out every 2 weeks on Wednesday as usual. Also, in addition to this, there is a new subset of Talking Rackheads that I've already started, which is called Talking Rackheads A Quick Word. And these are short, simple videos on any subject that comes up in between the period of Talking Rackheads main edition. There might be a new module, it might be something that I've just tried out and works, it might be to answer a question that someone's got. There'll be just little short, maybe 10 or 15 minute videos about any given subject, and those are released as and when I can throughout the week. Okay, so enough of this rambling, on with episode 7. To kick off this episode of Talking Rackheads, I'm going to show you a quick video on a question that I've been asked many times, and that is, how do I use an external Midi controller or keyboard to control functions and features in VCV Rack? And it's really very simple now, thanks to the latest updates in the v0.6 update to VCV Rack. So all you need to do is have a MIDI controller or keyboard or something else plugged into your computer. Now, if it's a USB device, it makes life very simple. If it's using a MIDI interface, then you need to know what the MIDI interface, whatever you plugged your controller into the MIDI interface, you need to know what port and what channel you're using. But I'm going to use the simplest example. I've got a Nectar Panorama P6, and that is a USB compliant MIDI controller and keyboard. So I'm going to use that, and it's got lots of knobs, lots of sliders on it. It's great for using with other MIDI devices, and in this case it's great with VCV Rack. So to set that up, all I do is right click and go to the core set of components, and here they are under core. Click that, and I'm looking for MIDI to CC. MIDI to CC, right there. And that opens up a little module like this. And all this module is, it's using, and I'm on a Mac, so this is the Mac version, but it works exactly the same in Windows as far as I can tell. This is your MIDI driver at the top here. This is where you would select your device, and this is where you set the channels. Now I want to leave it on all channels for the time being, and I'm going to click on No Device and then choose My Device, which in this case is the Panorama P6. Now note I've also got MIDI, other MIDI devices connected to this, and this is where they're all listed. I've also got, for example, a Prophet 12, I've got several other MIDI keyboards, and when they're plugged in they all show up in this list. But for now I'm going to keep things simple and just select the P6. So now the P6 is selected there, and I've now got 16 possible patch points that I can use. These are MIDI to CV outputs. And to assign a knob or a slider on my MIDI keyboard, all I do is click on one of the 16 slots available. So this one here is for this output here. And if I click on it, you'll see LRN, which means learn. So then all I do is turn the knob on my device, like this. And now you notice that number has changed to 48, because it's learned that the knob that I turned on my MIDI keyboard is actually sending out on the CC of 48. So now whenever I rotate that knob and I take an output from here, and in this case I'm going to put it to the volume controller for channel 1 here, and I'm going to take the output from this oscillator and feed that to the input like this. Now when I rotate the knob on my keyboard, you should hear the volume change for that channel. And there you go. Volume down, volume up. Now this next bit, what I'm going to do is I've reassigned this to another knob. So this is now to a different knob, and I'm going to take this output here and feed that to the mod input of the tiny saurish. And I'm going to assign that particular channel to a slider on my keyboard. Now I've accidentally assigned it to the same thing, so I need to do that again to assign it to something different. There we go. So now I've assigned the volume to 1 and this mod, which changes the sound of the waveform from the tiny saurish, to a slider. So now if I rotate the knob for the volume and move the slider for the modulation, you'll hear volume changes and you'll hear tonal changes. That's it. So now let's move on to a bigger patch. So now here's a patch putting all that into action. What I've done here is I've assigned 8 knobs from my Nectar Panorama 6 to 8 outputs in the Midi CC module, and each one of these, the top row is being assigned to the level control for the first 4 channels, and the second row are being assigned to the mod input for each of the 4 tiny saurishes I'm using. I'm having problems with my mouth today. And all I've done is set up these on different pitches with different rhythmic beats. And all I'm doing to create the rhythmic beats is taking an output from the BPM clock and feeding it to the mute in and mute out, mute in CV inputs. And so they're creating a random pattern of the notes being played and then not played, sort of like a gate effect. So now all I have to do is turn the knobs on my P6 and you'll hear the effects taking place. So that's channel 1. I just turned the volume up over here. Channel 2. Channel 3. channel 4. Now I'll change the tone by using the second set of knobs to change the mod inputs. There you go. So that's how to use external MIDI controllers to control CV inputs on either a mixer, or in this case I was also doing it on an oscillator, but it could be filter inputs on a filter module, it could be effect inputs on an effect module, whatever you want. You can just assign these. You've got up to 16 for one module, and so you've got 16 different CV inputable controllers, and these could be, as I said, sliders, knobs, whatever your MIDI controller allows. Okay, any questions, leave them in the comments below and I'll try and answer them as soon as possible. And I will put this patch in the patch pack, although bear in mind it depends on what your capabilities of your own MIDI device is as what you can do. Thanks. Hi, and welcome to another edition of Rack to Basics. Today we're going to be looking at clocks. Now, what's a clock? Well, a clock is a regular pulse or beat or gate that is sent out from a clock module to the rest of the modules in your VCV Rack patch. Think of a clock like the conductor of an orchestra. The clock sets a basic tempo or speed of a patch, and everything that connects to a clock is related to that original master tempo. Now in this instance I'm using the Master ×4 clock by MSC Hack, and the reason I'm doing this is that it's got a very clear indication of the clock speed. So for the purposes of this demo, this is a very easy way for you to see what tempo and what clock speed I'm using. So I've set the overall tempo, the master tempo for this piece, at 60, and that means 60 beats per minute, or 1 clock every second. I've also connected a hi-hat to the output of this clock, so when I start the clock we will hear a hi-hat trigger once every second, like this. So there is a clock being outputted from the master clock at exactly 60 BPM. And that is going to be the basic clock that I'm going to use throughout this patch. Now, to vary the speed of a clock, we use a clock divider or a clock multiplier. And what that means is we set a value, in this case using this knob here, to divide or multiply the number of clocks coming out of the output in comparison to the root clock, the 60 beats per minute clock here. So if I divide this clock by 2, that means that instead of playing 1 beat every second, it will play 1 beat every 2 seconds, like this. And if I multiply the clock by 2, then instead of playing 1 beat every second, it will play 2 beats every second, like this. If I multiply the clock by 4, it will play 4 beats every second, like this. And if I multiply it by 8, it'll play 8 beats per second. If I divide it by 4, it will play 1 beat every 4 seconds. Like that. And these are all, again, based on what the original clock was set for. In this case, 60 beats per minute, or 1 beat a second. Now, I've expanded on this patch now, and what I've done is I've set a kick drum going to the first clock, a hi-hat going to the second clock, a snare going to the third clock, and some claves going to the fourth clock. I've set the first clock so that it plays once every second. I've set the second clock so it plays 4 times every second. The third clock so it plays once every 2 seconds. I've divided it. And the fourth clock I've set to play 3 times every second. So we've got once a second, 4 times a second, once every 2 seconds, and 3 times a second. And this is how you set up a basic percussion patch. And it sounds something like this. I'm going to start off with just the bass drum and the hi-hat. So there we can hear the bass drum playing once a second, and we can hear the hi-hat playing 4 times a second. Now I'll turn up the volume of the snare, which will play once every 2 seconds. And now I'll turn up the volume of the claves from the hip percussion module, and that will play 3 times every second. You can hear that because I set this to 3 times a second, this is what we call a triplet pattern. And that just gives you an idea of what 4 different clocks are doing when you use them in combination. Now, of course, you don't have to use this for drum parts. You could use this for anything. And that's something we're going to explore in a moment. But I'm now going to play this clock again, but I'm going to change the values of the clock so you can hear how things interact and change with each other, like this. So the first thing I'm going to do is change the claves to be once every 3 clocks by dividing it by 3. And then I'm going to change the hi-hat to be 3 times a second. In other words, a triplet pattern like this. Now I'm going to speed up the hi-hat clock to 6 times a second. And I'm going to change the claves to be 3 times a second. Now I'll change the claves to be 2 times a second. And you can hear I'm getting different rhythmical patterns just by changing the divisions of clocks. So, what else are clocks used for? Well, in this patch, I've set up a basic sequence using AS's new Restep sequencer along with its companion apps. And I'm using a tiny sawish from AS as the oscillator and the slap hitting envelope from Volt as the VCA and envelope combined. And I'm using the clock output here from the master clock 2 times every second to trigger the sequence. So the sequence, which is an 8-note sequence, will play at 2 times a second for each note. So it will play this one and then this one, and then the next second it will play this one and this one, and then the next second it will play this one, and so on. And it will sound something like this. So there's the bass drum and the hi-hat. The bass drum playing once a second, the hi-hat playing 4 times a second. And now I'll turn on the sequence. And you hear the sequence playing 2 notes per second. Now if you notice, the output gate from the sequencer is going to the input gate on Volt. So the envelope is triggering 2 times a second in time with the sequence. So we get 1 hit, if you like, per note. So we get that little short sequencer blip. So now what I'm going to do is, instead of taking the output from the gate output of the sequencer, I'm going to take this cord and connect it to a clock output. And what this is going to do is, whilst the pitch of the sequence will continue to change twice every second, the clock, which I've set to 8 times, will trigger the gate 8 times every second. So you'll get that repeating ratcheting effect on the voice that will sound something like this. And if I change the envelope, you can emphasize that even more. Now if I change the clock speed, instead of 8 times, we'll do it 6 times. Then we get that sort of triplet effect on the ratcheting. So that's another way to use a clock to change the overall sound, by sending the clock output to a gate and having the gate to the envelope being a different clock speed to that of a sequencer. Now, I'm going to now set up another patch to show you a different way of using a clock. So what I've done here is I've added a BPM LFO from Frozen Wasteland. And what makes this LFO special is that it uses a clock input to determine its speed. Now I'm feeding it a clock of 1 beat per second from the master clock. But inside here it's got its own clock division setting. So I can rotate this knob here and set its own clock divisions. So this will rotate once every 4 beats. See this? Which means it will do its LFO cycle once every 4 beats. And I've taken an output of that and fed it to the input for the filter setting for the cutoff of this diode ladder filter by volt. So now when I play the sequence, we'll hear the gate and the pitch changing twice every second thanks to the sequencer, but we'll hear the filter opening and closing once every 4 beats, like this. And if I change the clock setting to say 1.5, then the filter will open and close 1.5 times every second, like this. Change it to twice a second, which is the same speed at which the sequencer is going. Now you can hear the filter opening and closing in time with the sequence. If I speed it up to 4, and you get that sort of effect. If I slow it all the way down to say 16, then it will take 16 beats for the filter to open and close. Which gives a sort of more evolving, moving pattern over time. So those are ways of using what we call regular clocks, regular steady clocks at different divisions or multiplications to create different rhythmic fields. But clocks don't have to be regular. They can also be irregular. And what I mean by that is that you can send a clock to, for example, a sequencer, and it doesn't have to be a steady stream of clocks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can actually create irregular clocks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And when you do that, you change the pattern the sequencer plays by giving it rhythmic variety or variation. And in order to show you that in action, I'm going to use another new plugin from AS called Rebit. Now what Rebit is it's actually 4 clock dividers. It doesn't have multiplication, it just has division. And each one has its own output. So if I took an output from here, then this would play at whatever clock speed I was feeding it, exactly the same. No division, it's just set at 0 at 1. So if I fed this clocks at 120 BPM, then from here I would get clocks coming out at 120 BPM. So when you use something like Rebit, you always want to feed it the fastest clock that you're going to need, because it cannot multiply clocks, it can only divide clock's pulses. So you can slow the clock down, but you can't speed it up. So feed it the fastest clock you're going to need. And in this case, I'm taking an output from the master times 4 clock at 4 times the standard BPM from here. So 4 times a second, basically. And I'm feeding that to the clock input. Now, there's a trick with the rebit. As I said, each of these is a clock divider. But there is this output here called sum. And what this does is it adds together the clock outputs from here. Now, it doesn't add them together as in if you take a division of 2 and add a division of 4, you get a division of 6. Doesn't work that way. But what it does do is that if you set a clock division of 2 and a clock division of 3 on the second row, then it will play a clock out of here every 2 divisions of the incoming clock, and it will also play one every 3 divisions of the incoming clock. So you'll get one every 2 beats and one every 3 beats, which gives you a rhythmic pattern. Let me show you what I mean. I'm just going to start the sequence playing, and then I'm going to change these settings here on rebit so you can hear the different sort of patterns, rhythmic patterns, that the sequencer will play. So here we can hear the standard pattern playing, and I'm going to remove the BPM LFO so you hear the notes playing all the time. Okay, so there's the basic sequencer pattern, which is running at fundamentally 2 times 2 notes every beat. And now I'm going to change the step division here. So now it's playing, sorry, it was 4 times every beat. Now it's playing 2 times every beat because I've set this to a division of 2 and the clock input is 4 times a second. So setting it to a division of 2 means it plays once every 2 incoming clocks. Now I'm going to set this one to 3, so it will play 1 clock every 2 beats and 1 clock every 3. You can hear that rhythmic pattern going on. Now I'm going to speed up the incoming clock to 8. And I'm going to change these settings to 4 and 9. And then change this one to 6. And change this one to 3. And you see how I've got that rhythmic variation going on in the sequence now. And it's playing a pattern that basically is the same pattern over and over again rhythmically after a certain period of time. You just turn these 2 off, and I'm going to change this one to 6 and this one to 2, and now change it to 5. And if I change this one to 3, so it's every 3 times and every 5 times, we get a different rhythmic pattern that the sequence is playing. And this becomes a very interesting way of creating cross rhythms and polyrhythms in a part just by adding different clock divisions to the incoming clocks, triggering a sequence. Or again, this could be a rhythmic pattern instead of a sequence. For example, instead of using the incoming clock to do this, I'll feed it a straight clock from the sequence, like say here. And I'm going to use the output here to trigger the gate of the envelope, like this. And now we're getting a rhythmic variance in the way the trigger of the envelope along with the BPM LFO gives a very interesting and different texture to the piece. And for the final patch in this particular episode, what I've done here is add another rebit with a different pattern, and I've taken the output of that and fed that to the input for the clock for the sequencer. So now we're going to get an irregular gate pattern from slap going into the filter, and also we're having an irregular gate pattern or clock pattern going into the sequencer. So these have got two entirely different rhythmic patterns that they're playing, and the way they come together, the way they interact based on the same incoming clock, becomes something quite musical but quite interesting. And it sounds something like this. And now I'm just going to take the trigger output for the hi-hat, and instead of using the straight clock output, I'm going to use another sum out from another rebit. Just to give another bit of rhythmic difference to the piece. Add a bit of reverb and a bit of delay to your sequencer channels, and your final patch sounds something like this. And you can jam along by changing the rebit steps, muting some of the sequence channels, changing the pitch in real time, and changing the hi-hat patterns, changing the rebit patterns for the actual triggers to the sequence, changing the LFO, adding a bit more resonance. You've instantly got all sorts of different variations on a theme. So there you go. That's a quick look at clocks and how to utilize them in patches. There are lots of other ways, of course, but for now, that's just a basic quick look. Hope you enjoyed this episode. There'll be another one soon. Bye. In this video, I'm going to play a patch and then break it down so that you can see how I use certain techniques to create the particular effects used in this patch. However, first of all, I want to take a look at a couple of the modules that I use in this patch, which I don't think I've used in any other so far. So the first thing I want to look at is this Mixovnik mixer from KoralFX. Now, those who've watched my videos before know that typically I use the VCV Console Mixer. I find that while it's a paid-for plugin, it's also one of the better, more feature-filled mixers that you can use. That's not to say that some of the other mixers aren't great, and I do use some of the other ones, especially, for example, CF's Build Your Own Mixer system, where he has individual channels that you can add as many of as you want. But typically for the master mixer, I use VCV's console. And the reason I use it is because it's got so many modulation inputs, allows me to be very creative with it and have a lot of control. However, its limitation, if you want to call it a limitation, is that it is just an 8-channel mono mixer. And if I want to work in stereo, which I typically do, that cuts down the number of channels from 8 to 4. And where the Mixovnik really scores is that it's a 16-channel mixer in the same, or actually just slightly less HP than the VCV console. It's also a free plugin, which is a credible bonus as well. And so using this 16-channel mixer means that I can actually work, as I tend to work in stereo, with 8 channels in one mixer, which makes life a lot simpler. Also, one of the great things about this mixer is that the channels are linkable. So what does that mean? Well, that means that here, for example, I've got a stereo channel, 2 inputs coming from, in this case, a Noxious off-screen. And when I move the slider on the left-hand side, typically that will only change the volume of the left channel that I'm using from the stereo pair. But when you turn link on here, the left slider increases or decreases the volume for both left and right. So it makes it a lot simpler when you're mixing, that you don't have to keep fiddling with 2 channels instead of just 1, which is really all you want. So fundamentally, pressing the link control turns this into a dual channel or stereo channel volume control. The same applies to the mute and the solo buttons. Pressing mute in link mode mutes both the left and right channels together, rather than having to press 2 mutes to achieve the same thing in a typical normal mixer. So that's a really good bonus. The other part of this that's interesting is that it's got a mix-in input. And what this means is you can use another mixer and feed the left and right output from that mixer into here without using up one of the pairs of channels. So that's really useful too. So all in all, for a 16-channel mixer is pretty darn good. It's got 2 auxiliary inputs, channel 1 and channel 2 here for your send and returns. That's really good. Like it. It's got mute buttons for both, And the master channel is also linkable. So again, you've got a left and right balance on the output mix, but you can also have one single control for both channels. Great stuff. However, there are a couple of limitations with this that I wish had been added. And I understand purely from the amount of HP, it probably wasn't possible. But even so, I do find they limit the way I use it. And two of the biggest ones for me are that there are no CV inputs for the mute and the solo buttons. And again, if you've watched any of my videos, you'll know that I often use automated muting techniques to bring channels in and out in a mix. And when I'm mixing and working live, then I'm often turning channels on and off using, for example, AS's Trigger Mark II to turn channels on and off when I need them so that I can mix live while the patch is playing. And that's impossible here. You can't do that. You do have a CV input for pan and for volume, and so you can sort of mix live using the volume controls in pairs, for example, but it's still not the same thing as a proper mute. And so you can't have the flexibility that, for example, VCV's console has when you're doing a live mix. Another missing feature for me is that in the VCV console, you've got two sends and returns, but you've also got that master effects channel for adding an overall effect across the entire mix, like a small amount of reverb or something of that nature. And I do find I miss that too. The last thing, and I'm not sure if this is a bug or it's just the way it's meant to be, but I find the scaling of the volume on the sliders is a little weird. It's like it's very high scaled, so I find I run the sliders in very low positions compared to how I would set things up in VCV Console. And again, the same with the mix output. I have to keep it fairly low, otherwise things are incredibly loud and sometimes quite distorted. Now, that might be my problem more than anyone else because I'm used to mixing with VCV Console, and so it's quite possible I'm sending very high levels to this mixer that it's not accustomed to, whereas VCV Console seems to handle those much better. But I'm going to point that little issue out because it is a little odd for me, and it seems like the scaling is a little bit off. I'll also say that I find the scaling on the aux knobs is a little off as well. Again, it seems to be a very small change at the beginning, and then suddenly it's a large change as you rotate the knob. So not sure whether that was a deliberate choice or whether it's something I'm doing wrong, but you know, that's what I find. So having said the pros and cons like that, would I use this in replacement of VCV Console? Sometimes, but definitely not always. And I may use this in addition to VCV Console at times when I'm mixing down a lot of stereo channels, or I'm mixing down polyphonic oscillators like the Noxious Poly, for example. This would be very, very useful. But as a standalone master mixer, as the main mixer for my projects, I'll use it sometimes, but it doesn't replace, for me, VCV Console. A module I'm going to feature in this patch breakdown is the updated version of the Quad Sequencer by Aepelzen. Now, before I get into this sequencer, I'll say that it's pretty difficult sometimes to find the binaries for his range of plugins. They're not easily available through the typical means like the plugin manager or even through GitHub. But if you search through the Facebook VCV group, you will find the current versions of the Aepelzen plugins have been posted for at least, I know, Windows and Mac, and I think the Linux ones are up as well now. And I will try to include links in the video comment section below for those looking for them. But I will say that I really enjoy some of his plugins. They're a little different to what most other plugin devs do, and they have these little quirks and extra features which in some cases make some of his plugins really quite special and well worth investigating. And in this case, I'm using the quad sequencer, and you may have seen me use this before, but I'll quickly go over what makes it different to a standard sequencer. And the first thing that's really different about the quad sequencer is that you can set different step lengths for each of the 4 sequences. So it's a 4-channel, 8-step sequence, and you can set the number of steps for each channel individually through this little knob here. You've got a range button here for each of the 4 channels, and what that does is when you rotate a knob to select a pitch, this knob dictates the range from 1 octave to 8 octaves, for example. So you can limit the range and makes it easier to find the particular note or notes that you're looking for. The third knob I'm going to look at is the mode knob down here, and what that does is it affects the playback mode of each of the channels. And there are, I think, 5 particular modes. You've got forward, reverse, forward and reverse together, so it plays 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 7 6 5 4 3 2 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8, which is an interesting variation when you need it. And then it's also got the drunken walk mode, which is a mode where it will play, for example, 1 2 3 4, and then it will go back 1 step to 3, then it will go forward a couple of steps to 4 5, and then back 1 step to 4, then it might go 5 6 7, and then back 2 steps. So it's sort of a semi-random mode, but musically it's playing the notes really still in the order for most of the time that you programmed them in. And then finally, the last mode is a fully random mode, which picks notes out from your sequence at random and plays them back. And that's basically, these 3 functions were in the last version of Quad Sequencer. But he's added a new function to it, and that is the probability function for each channel. And this is interesting because it does 2 different things. The default position is in the 12 o'clock, and if you rotate the knob to the right, what it starts to do is skip steps every so often. So, like randomly, it will not play a particular step. It will do it for a little while and then it will stop. And if you watch the lights here, you'll see I'm in that random mode, and most of the time it plays 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. But every so often it will skip a step and not play it, which lets the sequence develop that sort of semi-random but still musically intact effect from the piece. And for those that have followed, the sort of patches I like to make, I'm all for random elements, but random elements for me that are also musically related to the piece that I'm working on. So it's not just a stream of random notes all over the place, but that they sort of evolve and become musically interesting within the piece itself. If you turn the knob to the left, then what happens is it pauses on certain steps and will stay there and then carry on to the next one. So rather than skip, it extends the length of certain steps. And again, the more you turn it to the left, that more is likely to happen, until if you're at full left, what happens is it stays on one particular step for a long time. And so you just balance what you need. A little bit of probability will mean that when you're playing, every so often it will stop on a step and just hold that for longer than normal and then carry on with the rest of the sequence. And again, that adds an interesting rhythmic and musical flavour to the sequence. The other features of the quad sequencer, which were the same in the previous version and are very important to me, are the fact that each channel has its own clock input. So each channel can run at a different clock rate or BPM all together in one system, which I absolutely love. And that's such a useful feature because it means that I can have two sequences running at 120 BPM and then another sequence running at 60 and another running at 30, for example, for maybe a bass part or something similar, all done within the same sequencer. And then you've got the 4 outs for the volt per octave outputs of the pitches. There are a couple of things I wish this did have that it doesn't. The primary thing I wish it had would be gate outputs for each of the channels. You know, as well as a volt per octave output, I wish it had a gate output for each, because then you could trigger gates in sequence along with when it pauses and when it skips a step. It would allow the same rhythmic quality to come out. But unfortunately, it doesn't, so you have to live with that. And the other thing that I wish it had would be a built-in quantizer, but it's no big deal to add a second quantizer, an external one, to the outputs. The only difficulty, of course, is you got 4 channels, 4 quantizers are needed. But again, you know, I'm being picky. The quad sequencer as it is one of my favorite standalone sequencers that I use when I need random steps, when I need semi-random steps, and also when I want to do polyrhythmic stuff, because again I can set, you know, for example, 5 steps on the first channel, 4 on the second, 7 on the third, 8 on the fourth, for example, and that gives a constantly changing and evolving effect with the musical output. So, you know, no big deal, but you know, those couple of minor limitations don't prevent me from having a heck of a lot of fun with this sequencer. And here is what the full patch looks like. And I'm going to quickly give you an overview of the individual parts, and then I'll play the whole piece together so you can see how all the parts fit together. What I've got here is, in essence, 3 voices coming from the quad sequencer. Now I've left this with the cables in full opacity so you can see how things are connected together as an overview, and if you want to pause the video and take a closer look at that, now's the time to do that, because I'm going to now turn down the opacity of the cables so you can actually see the modules going on behind. Okay, so the first voice I'm going to talk about is this voice here. And what this is, these 4 modules here, I'm using a single voice Noxious to play a rhythmic melodic pattern. And I'm using the output from this channel here in the quad sequencer going into a ReQ by AS. And that sets up the scale and also the root note and the range of octaves that it uses. And then from there I'm going from an output to the volt per octave input of the Noxious, and I've set up a voice in the Noxious which takes full advantage of the spread and settle controls to give those interesting rhythmic changes over time that Noxious is so good at. It sort of creates these animated texture changes whilst playing melodic patterns, which are very interesting. Then from that I go into the Russian filter, the Vortex, again by Volt, and I take the low pass output, I go into the input for the VCA of, again, Volt Slap envelope, which I love. It's not necessarily going to be the be all and end all of all envelopes, but I actually find myself using it a lot, mainly because It's got a built-in VCA, and you can get a lot of interesting envelopes from it, even though it's really designed as a sort of a sharp hitting type envelope. You can get quite drawn out envelopes and nice changes in envelope shapes and things from this. And I'm actually using this in the hard mode, which means the envelopes I'm using with this particular sound are very snappy, very sharp, very short envelopes to give that effect. And then the output from that here is going, I've taken two outputs to put them into left and right channels in my mixer. Now, why have I done that? Well, that's because I've got send and returns that are going to two effects units, 2 delay plus FX by AS, and these delays are set to different times. So I want the left and right channel. The left channel goes to this effect, the right channel goes to this effect, and this gives a really nice ping pong echo effect. And if I only fed it to one channel, I wouldn't get that effect. I'd just get the effect coming out of one side. So I've split the output, the mono output, from this noxious oscillator and put it to a left and right channel so that I get that stereo effect from the ping pong. And I've also given it a little bit of reverb from the XFX reverb by Blamsoft. Again, a paid for plugin, but I'm still, for me, this is the best reverb currently available on VCV Rack. And as such, I have it in almost all of my patches, sometimes to produce a lot of reverb, sometimes just for touches of it. But I haven't found an overall better reverb to date. That may change in the future, but for now, it's a stereo in, stereo out reverb that I believe the quality of is not being surpassed by any other reverb so far. And so this is what that part sounds like. You can hear all those little tonal changes going on thanks to the Noxious. And a very short little filter and a very short envelope to trigger it. And again, because of the way that I set up the delays through the send and returns, you can hear that stereo ping pong effect going on left and right. And if you can't hear that effect, can I recommend that you use a pair of headphones or a good pair of stereo speakers to listen to this, so you can get the full effect of what's going on. Okay, so that's the first sort of rhythmic core patch that I've got running in here for this patch. The second part is a straightforward kick drum part, and I'm using the RCK kit kick from AS. I love this kick because it's got so much punch to it that it really cuts through a mix. And also with this one, I've added just a touch of delay to it. So what it gives an effect of a triplet bass drum part, but the echoes are sort of not too far up front, so it sort of gives a running feel to the kick drum, with the loud kick still happening on the beat, but the echoes feeding in behind it to give it some movement, like this. And it just gives a different feel to a straight 4 to the floor bass drum part. And I'm using that just to give the whole patch some core fundamental rhythmic stability that everything else feeds onto. Now the next part of this patch is I'm using the Noxious Poly version. And I'm sort of playing a trick with this, because what I'm using this Noxious for is two different sounds, but playing the same sequence. And in reality, there are actually four different sounds playing at the same time, but they're not sounds that are being created by the Noxious, because the Noxious can only generate one sound at a time, even though it's a polyphonic output. It's still four copies of the same voice. But what I'm using is I'm using an envelope here, and I've got one envelope per output, and I've changed the length of the envelopes for each output. So for example, this one is a short length envelope, this one's longer, this one's even longer, and this one's shortest of all. And when you take those four different envelopes together, you get a very different sounding sound from each of the pairs of channels. Because what I've done is I've taken an output from here, from each of these VCAs that are built into the slap, and given them their own channel, and then panned them hard left and right. And I've also added just a tiny bit of reverb, to the first two, and a lot of echo to the second two. And the second two's envelopes are longer, more sustained envelopes, and the first two are shorter, more plucked envelopes. And so here's what the first two sound like. And here's what the second two sound like layered together. And I changed the decay length there to make the right channel of the second pair longer, so it gives a more interesting textural change between the two voices. So putting those two together gives the foundation sequence for the melodic part of the rhythmic part of the patch. And if I play all three of these parts together, you'll see how they all link together, and musically they combine together in a way that I like this. So that's the second part, and both of these parts, the sequencer tracks that are coming out of the quad sequencer, I've got a probability turned to the right on both of them. And so what that means is most of the time they play in order, but every so often they'll skip a step, so they go out of sync with each other. And that creates a constantly evolving and changing sequence between the two. When they start off, they're playing in time with each other, and then as they go through, they get slightly out of sequence with each other. So every time they loop, the combination of the two notes is different. And that gives, again, a constantly evolving feel and change to the sequence. And now, here's Greg with another one of his excellent 10-minute modules.
Hello folks, and welcome to another 10-minute modular here on Talking Rackheads. Today I'm going to talk about the New York Echo by NYEcho. Of course, it might also be the NYEcho.
Who are you? We are the knights who say ni. No, not the knights who say ni.
No, that would just be silly. Okay, so what is the New York Echo? This basically mimics a tape echo machine. Now, whatever comes into the input, imagine that this circular loop here is actually a disc with recording magnetic tape on the outside. And so this is the record head. Basically, whatever comes into the input gets recorded here. And then each of these are playback heads. And we can mimic moving these heads closer or further away from the record head by moving the millisecond knob. So first of all, let's see what I have coming in. All right, we have a little sequence here. And it's being recorded on this tape, and notice that none of the tape heads are on. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn tape head 1 on. And you can hear a slapback echo because I only have 43 milliseconds. What if I extend that? Yeah, right around 60 milliseconds we start hearing it as a separate echo. And that's kind of cool that in that range, if we move the echo, we get a chorus. But that's not what this does because that knob is not, we can't modulate that. But what if we add a second tape return? You hear a couple of those slapback echoes. What if we move way out here and add another return? Well, we're getting 3 echoes. What if those echoes are too fast? Well, we could turn this disc, turn the speed down. Which gives us some really interesting rhythms. Now I want to show you something. We have an erase head up here. Let me turn these off to make it a little easier to hear. Okay, hear that echo? Let's turn the echo off. And I'll turn one of these echoes on. Hear how we have multiple echoes? It's bump, 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 bump. They're getting fainter and fainter. If I turn the erase head on, we will get exactly 1 echo. Or if I turn this off, basically what's happening is that the signal's getting weak as it goes around, as it's being read, and it's being recorded on top of, so it kind of loses the original signal, but we'll get, here, we'll get these tails. By using magnetization and swell, I can go into really insane levels of feedback. Of course, if I want real insanity, all I have to do is move warps a little bit. But that's another episode. So let's turn the erase head back on. So So we get back to just a single echo. Well, what this means is we could actually set up some timing. So let's slow this down a little bit. And I'm going to try to set the tap tempo here with this trigger. Now it says there's a button here, but I haven't had much luck making that tap tempo work. So I'm going to put a button trigger on it. Click, 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 click. Okay. Okay, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get a dotted eighth note echo. So what I need is a much slower echo. Okay, so if 200 milliseconds is essentially double, then I think 600 milliseconds is about what I want. So I want to slow this down until I get about 600. And what I'm doing is I'm looking right here and I'm trying to adjust this with the control key down to get very fine adjustments. That's going to be pretty close. I'm hoping that this echo will come in 1.5 beats late. There we go. So we could set up these really interesting patterns. What if I, let's see, 300. Let's set this about 300, about half of that. Course, because we have trigger inputs, we could toggle them on and off. Let's toggle both those echoes on and off. We can put a button here that turns that erase on and off. We also have tap in and tap out. Okay, we were talking about tap tempo earlier, where I was trying to set a tempo by putting a trigger here and tapping my timing and setting it up. And it turned out it wound up just being easier to play with it by hand. That's not what this tap out. It doesn't mean I'm literally tapping something on an input or output. What it means is that instead of having this input come in at this record head or record head, I have it come in at a different record head. So let's say this output from this VCO, I'm going to have it come in here. I'm going to turn it way down. And as I turn it up, you're going to hear that this voice is going to be coming in at the point of the first echo. Now if I was to put this, say, on 2, nothing's coming through until I turn the echo on. And what's interesting is since it's coming in, it's being echoed here and also echoed here. Okay, so what do the outputs do? Well, just what you would think. Since tap in is say, let's insert a signal at a record head or a play head. Let's tap it out. So let's take the signal out of tap 6, put it through a chorus and reverb. So we're literally pulling it out here this output is the merge of all of the outputs. Well, folks, I hope that gives you an idea of how the NYEcho works to some extent. And that's it for 10-Minute Modular today. Thanks for listening to Talking Rackheads. Thanks for coming over and visiting at Modular Curiosity. And all right, Nigel, it's back to you, buddy. Take it away.
Brilliant, Greg. Really, really enjoyed that. And for anyone who's got any ideas on sort of the subjects or topics that Greg could cover in 10-minute modules, maybe a module, maybe some technique or something, then please check out the VCV Rack Facebook page. Do a search for Greg and you'll find he's made a post there where you can submit ideas and thoughts of what you would like to see him do a 10-minute module piece on. I'll also try and include a link to that post in the comments below. Once again, thanks, Greg. Really appreciate all your hard work. Cheers. And now, on to the next item. And now it's time for another 5 patches using 5 modules in 30 minutes. And today's modules of choice are the Mixovnik, which is a 1, 2 or 4 channel sequencer. Very interesting little module this. Lets you configure in different ways. So you can have 4 8-step sequences, or 2 16-step sequences, or 1 32-step sequence. It's also got a built-in quantizer, though I will say I sometimes find the quantizer is not that accurate high up. Some of the notes seem to be out of tune, just a little bit here and there. I don't know if that's a problem with the scaling of the quantizer or whether that's just a general issue with the routine used for quantizing. But most of the time you can get around it. You've got individual step lengths, you've got dotted and triplets, you've got legato and staccato, you've got accents, and you've got inputs to start and stop and reset individual channels. You've got a single gate input, a single clock input, but bear in mind, because you can change the step lengths, you can reproduce different clock divisions per sequence. So you could have, for example, sequence A running at 16ths and then sequence B doubling the step length would make that appear to be running at 8ths, and then quadrupling the step length here would make sequence C appear to be running in 4th notes. So you can reproduce that quite easily. You've also got transposition for the sequence if you need it. You've got a clock BPM output. So you've got quite a lot of functionality over here. There are a couple of things I wish it did do. I wish you could save the run state, so when you launch a patch, it would automatically reset and run the sequencer upon startup of the patch, but it doesn't do that, unfortunately. The other great feature I love on here is the audition mode, which is where you can take hold of the note, move up and down, and on the left hand side here, see which note you're inputting. And when the volume's up, you'll actually hear this triggering the synth voice as you're moving up and down. So this becomes a very simple way of setting up a sequence, either visually by note if you're a musician, or by ear if you're not. Or if you are, you can use both at the same time. So that's the first module. Second module is the E34 Cloud Generator. This is one of the modules that comes free with every VCV rack. It's a very underused module, and it's actually quite interesting, some of the things it can do. It's sort of got a chord mode, a detune, and this is what the spread does. It's also got this chaotic sort of ability with an input to give some tonal qualities and changes over time. It's got plenty of inputs. The spread feature is like a doubling up of oscillators. You can have 2, 4 or 8 oscillators all running at the same time. And it's got a lot of CV inputs to do things like FM and synchronization. And you can synchronize the spread. Sorry, you can CV the spread itself. You can modulate that, the chaos and the chaos bandwidth that's running here. It also has 2 outputs, a saw wave and a sine wave. So in lots of these patches, I'm using these 2 outputs in different ways to get different tones. For example, in this one, I'm sending the sine out straight to the mixer, but the saw I'm sending out through the next module, which is the Valeri voltage controlled MS-20 type filter, and that's from Lindenberg Research. Sorry, and I love this filter. It is very familiar to me as an old MS-20 owner. This filter is pretty close to what the MS-20 sounded like to my ears. I will say it's been about 15 years since my MS-20 emitted smoke and died, but you know, from what I remember, this is pretty close. Then the next module is a straightforward attack decay envelope, and this comes from NYEcho or NISTI, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And what I like about this envelope is, while you can set the attack and the decay, you've also got things like scaling, which will alter the length of both parameters at the same time. And also, if you reverse the scale, then it inverts the envelope, which can give some very interesting effects. And I'm going to be using that capability in 1 or 2 of the patches. And then finally, I'm using the Gnome, which is an all-in-one synth voice from South Pole. And this is a VCO, LFO, VCF, ADSR, all pre-wired in one module, which allows for some interesting single synth voices in a very compact and easy to understand format. So those are the 5 modules: a sequencer, a noise generator, or actually a cloud generator doing one voice, a filter, an attack decay envelope, and an all-in-one synth voice. And so here is the first patch. I've set up the sequencer to be 2 8-step sequences, sorry, 2 16-step sequences, and I've left all the step settings exactly the same, so it's just 2 straightforward 16-step sequences. I'm using the cloud generator to play one of the sequences. In fact, I'm using sequence A and B for the first voice, which is the cloud generator, and I'm using the cloud generator in very straight mode, not spreading any voices, not doing else, just giving a standard saw wave output and a sine wave output. The saw wave is going into the filter, coming out of the filter and going straight to the mixer. And then I'm using an envelope to trigger the frequency. And you can see here the envelope moving. You can see this little arrow showing you how far around the filter is going to be opening in time with this attack decay envelope. Then the Gnome, I've set up a straightforward voice. I'm using the envelope of the Gnome here, which is being gated from the sequence, and I'm using the VCO output straight to the mixer. I've added some reverb and some delay to all these patches just to give a sort of thickening sound to it. Sorry, that's the audio output. Here's the VCO input from sequence C and D. So let's have a listen to what it sounds like. there you go, just a straightforward sequence. Now, in the second patch, I've changed the sequence patterns, and I've also given the sequence some rhythmic qualities by using a combination of 8th and 16th note steps to give each pattern its own rhythmic quality. And also, as you'll notice, on the last step here, the last 8 steps of the second pattern, I've turned on the triplet functionality and the staccato functionality, so these last 8 steps will play as triplets. So these will play as either 8th or 16th notes, and then these will play as triplets to give a rhythmic variety to the pattern. I've added a little bit of detune this time to the cloud generator, and I'm also modulating the FM input and the chaos input via the LFO coming out of the gnome. But the cloud generator's own outputs, one's going directly to the mixer and one again is going into the filter, out from the filter to the mixer, and the mixer itself, so the filter itself, is again being triggered by a different envelope shape this time in the AD, and you can see here the trigger going off. And then finally I've set up a different synth voice using the gnome, and I've created a few little tricks with it. I'm using an envelope output here to change the shape of the FM input here on the cloud generator, which gives some tonal change to the cloud. But I'm using basically a contour that's like a built-in envelope shaping to the filter as well here. And then the LFO I'm not using at all for the internal voice, I'm just routing it out to use it as modulators for the cloud generator. Okay, so this is what this sounds like. Moving on from the last patch, I've made some changes to the sequence pattern. I've turned off the triplets for the second pair. I've changed some of the notation, and I've also changed the rhythmic pattern of this. I've made basically this lead sequence a lot slower in its tonal changes. And so what I've done is changed up the set and the sound of the cloud generator, altered the filter a little bit, but the biggest change as far as the first voice is that I've turned the scale knob to the left and increased the attack and the decay, so now we'll get an inverted envelope, which will give some like slow filtering and opening and closing effects, and a much more gentle filter, not a snappy filter, to the lead voice. Then the synth voice, I've just changed the tonal wave of the gnome, altered the envelopes a little bit just to match up. Other than that, it's basically similar to the setup for the last patch, but gives an entirely different sound. Change the sequence, change the notes, and also you'll notice here I've set much longer notes for parts of this sequence, and then the second sequence being played by the gnome is very short, but again I'm using triplets, and I've also shortened the length of the sequence instead of 16 notes to 12, so basically it plays in triplets 4 parts of 3 notes, giving you 12 in total. So this will stay in time with the basic pattern rhythm. I've changed the cloud generator a little bit, taken off a little bit of the spread to make it a thinner sound, but added a bit of chaos to it this time, a bit of bandwidth chaos, only a tiny bit, so we get a sort of change in tonal quality over time. The filter I've altered, and this time I've increased the attack level. So if you notice, in time with these slow notes, the filter's opening quickly and then slowly closing, giving a different, much more mellow effect to the filter. And then the gnome, again, I've changed things. I've upped the envelope this time on the filter so that the gnome voice is very staccato, but also is very open in terms of its wave sound. But I've chosen a much more triangular wave here, so that again the overall sound is much more mellow, and it sounds something like this. And for this final patch, what I've done is actually change things around. Instead of the cloud generator sequence playing the slower notes, this time I've given the slower notes to the gnome to play, and I'm using the cloud generator with a very quick, snappy, but wide opening and closing of the filter to give an almost wah effect when it's being played. A little bit of spread, which gives a sort of detuning effect, and a very normal verted scale, so the attack and the decay for the Valeri filter is very sharp and to the point. This gives a very different effect overall, even though the basic sounds are much the same as they were the last time. Sounds like this. And there you go. So there's your 5 patches from 5 modules in 30 minutes. This one was quite interesting to play with, these 5. It was a little tricky because the cloud generator is quite limited in the sort of sounds it can produce, although, you know, it's sort of limited, it's not really. But the fact of having 2 outputs and a detune, again the spread, and I could have used the spread in much wider modes to produce chords, but that wasn't where my experimenting led me to this time. I love the Valeri filter. Some people have said they call it Valerie. I actually prefer Valeri, but hey, whichever it is. It's a pretty good MS-20 type filter. And also, I like the gnome. It's just really simple little voice to put together, but you can get a lot of tonal, interesting voices out of it. And it's very quick, simple to set up. And as I said in one of my previous videos, the gnome is one of those modules that I tend to use a lot when I'm building patches, and sometimes I leave it in place, or sometimes I just use it as a sort of temporary voice until I come up with a bigger or fatter voice that I might need to use. But more than often, the gnome actually does the job. And then finally, this little AD attack and decay envelope. I really like this. I'd never actually used this before, and it's got some very interesting little tricks to it, using the scale knob and the linear and exponential outputs are pretty good, and a manual trigger as well. So, and the looping capability is quite interesting as well. It's worth investigating. Finally, the sequencer. Yeah, it's a pretty good sequencer. It's quite nice. It's easy to use. I love the ability to see and hear the notes in real time as I'm moving the sliders up and down. That's really cool. Again, as I said at the beginning, I think the quantizing is not quite accurate, especially at the higher ranges, but I'm sure that's just something that needs tweaking. And what I often do myself is use an external quantizer between the Skorovnik and the synth voice just to correct any out of tune notes. But other than that, pretty darn good, I've got to say. And I actually enjoyed these 5, and I hope you did too. See you next time. Hi, and welcome to another Rack to Basics. Today, I'm going to look at mixers. Now, this is the VCV Console Mixer, and while it's a paid plugin, this is probably one of the best mixers available simply because it has so many options and modulation possibilities that I can demonstrate almost everything that any other mixer can do just using this one mixer. Now, many people have contacted me and said they don't really understand how mixers and mixing works in VCV Rack and Modular in general, so I thought this would be a good topic for another Rack to Basics. So this is a mixer. It's actually a 8-channel mixer. That means that there are 8 individual inputs that you can feed signals into. And these channels, there are 8 of them, are mono channels. That means that when you feed a signal into here, it's a mono input and provides a mono signal to the mixing desk itself. And you can feed 8 separate channels in. And then on this side, here are the 8 levels for each of the channels. So this is the volume level that you can set for each channel. Now, this mixer has several sort of additional capabilities, which I'll go into shortly. But fundamentally, for each channel, there is a solo button. And what solo means is that when you click this button here, and you get a little green light, all the other channels are muted, so you can only hear this channel. Beneath it is a mute button, and what that means is that when you click it, it turns off this channel and you can hear the rest of the channels but not this one. So this is sort of like a dual option functionality. You can hear just that channel, or you can click here and not hear that channel at all. Then beneath that, you've got a pan button, like a knob. And what that does is takes the mono signal in here and allows you to basically position it in the stereo field to the left or to the right by turning this knob. So here the sound would come out of the left speaker only. Here the sound would come out of the right speaker only. And then anywhere in between places that sound in the stereo image. Then you've got 2 additional knobs below, labeled Sound A, or actually Send A and Send B. And I'll cover what those do in a moment, but basically these are used for adding effects to this channel. Then underneath this, there is this M button, and what this does is when you're using effects, it turns off the original sound and only lets you hear the affected sound at the levels you've chosen here. And again, I'm going to demonstrate this shortly, so no worries. Then on the right hand side, you've got 2 send and returns. And again, I'll cover this in a little more detail, but basically these are the levels of the effects generally across the entire mixer for the effects you add to the A channel and the effects you add to the B channel. Then there is a master effects channel that affects both the A and the B effects levels. And finally, you've got a master volume, which is the level you set of volume for all 8 channels together. And this you can turn up and down. You've got visual indicators here to show you what the levels are. And then you've got a pair of mute buttons for the overall left and right outputs. So if I click this button here, there would not be any sound going from the mixer to my audio device on the left channel. If I click this one, it would mute the right channel. And then here, these 2 little outputs here, these are the left and right outputs that you take and put into your left and right inputs on your audio card or audio device. So that's the basics of a mixing desk, and fundamentally these are the features that Console have. So now what I'm going to do is wire up a simple patch and show you how this all works in reality. So here is a simple patch I've set up. We've got the console here, and I've created a simple sequenced synth part, which I'm taking the output from the slap over here and feeding it into input number 1 on the mixer. So this is what you will hear. Turn the master volume up. And there is the sequence playing. If I press the X here, it will mute that part. There we go. Unclick the X and it will unmute that part. If I rotate the pan to the left, then the sound of the sequence will start to become more predominant on the left-hand speaker, like this. Until it's fully on the left. And if I rotate the pan knob the other way, then the sound comes predominantly out of the right speaker, until eventually it only comes out of the right speaker and not out of the left. And to recenter the pan, all you have to do is right click on the button and that'll put the control back to the default position, which is central. Just like that. Now, I've set up some effects on the send and returns, and I'll explain to you how I've done this. So here on send A, I've added the NY stereo phaser, and I've taken the inputs, left and right inputs, because this is a stereo effect, and connected them to the send left and send right inputs or on the send and return. So you can see here, this cable goes to the right input and this cable goes to the left input. So what's happening here is the sound from this channel 1, at the moment nothing's going through it because I've got the send A turned all the way down. But if I increase the send A amount, then some of the signal will be sent out from these 2 outputs here into the stereo phaser, and then from the 2 stereo outputs of the phaser be fed back into the return portion of that send and return channel. So it adds some of the signal going through the phaser and then back into the main mixer itself. So you'll get this sort of effect if I turn up the send A control. and by turning this knob, I'm adding that effect to only this channel and not any other channel. If I turned up this effect, nothing would happen. Now the next channel I've used, the send B and return B, is an identical copy of send A and return A, but this time I've taken the outputs here and fed them into a stereo delay line, in fact a pair of them, and I've set them at different values to get a sort of ping pong effect. So from the left channel the signal leaves the mixer, goes into the input on this delay plus FX from AS, and then the signal comes out from here and goes into the left return. On the right channel I've taken the output here from the send right and sent it into the second of the two delay lines, and this one's got a different timing so that the delay comes back at a different time, and then the output from that goes into the return right side of the send B and return B. So this will give an effective ping pong effect where you'll hear the returns from the left channel will be at different times from returns on the right channel, giving a nice ping pong stereo effect like this. And the more I turn the send B to the right, the more of the effect we'll hear. And the less I turn it, the less of the effect we'll hear. And the idea of this is to find the right balance between the original signal, this signal, and the effect signal coming back in. Now if I turn on send A as well, now we get a bit of that stereo phasing and we get the delays going through. Now if I want to remove the original sound, this sound here, and only want to hear the affected sounds, then this is what the M button does at the bottom. If I click it, you'll only hear the affected sounds and not the original unaffected sounds. And sometimes that's a very nice effect to use where you don't hear any of the original sound, you only hear the sounds that have passed through your effects units. In this case, the stereo phaser and the two delays. And if I click this button again, you'll hear the original sound added back into the mix. So that's the send A and send B individual channel returns and sends. Now you've also got on this side master send and return levels, and these affect all the sends for all the channels on A and B. So if I turn down the send A, that turns off the stereo phaser, and if I turn it back on again, it turns it up. But remember, in this instance it overrides what's set here in these individual channels and affects all the channels at once. And the return A does much the same thing, but turns off the return signal rather than turning off what's being sent to the stereo phaser. And you can use this to balance the effect across all the channels by adding more of the effect or less of the effect on all the channels. And the same applies to the B send and the B return. If I turn down the send B, then the amount of signals sent to the delay portions across all the channels will be affected. And if I turn the return down, then all the signal coming back from the delays will be reduced or increased. So this is like a master volume effect level control for both the A channel and the B channel. And that's what these two channels do. Now we have a third channel, and I think I may have mistakenly said this affects both these. That's not true. I apologize. What this does is add an effect to all the channels. So it's another effect that you can add to it, but this doesn't have individual amounts to each channel. It just affects all the channels equally. And in this case, I've taken the send and returns from here and fed them into a reverb, and then the outs from the reverb into the returns for this. So this reverb and the amount I set here will affect all the channels equally. So this is like an overall effect unit for everything, and you would get this sort of effect from it. So that's no reverb coming back from the reverb unit, and then as I turn the knob to the right, we hear more of the effect being added to all the channels. And I'm going to show you how all the channels work together in a moment. But for now I'm just doing this on one channel to keep things simple. So you would set an overall balance of the reverb, say about here. And that gives you a nice little amount of reverb, but bear in mind this reverb will be on all the channels, not just on one. Okay, now I'm going to set up a second patch so you can see how this works with 2 or 3 instruments all playing at the same time. So here's the next patch. And what I've done here is I've added a XFX wave from Blamsoft and an XFX F35. They don't make them easy to say these things, you know. And the reason I've added these is because this is a stereo oscillator, so it has stereo outputs, and the filter has stereo inputs and outputs. So I've connected another sequence through to the wave and then taken the stereo outputs from the wave into the filter and then out from the filter left and right into 2 channels in the mixer. In this case channel 7 for the left output and channel 8 for the right output. And so now when I play this, you'll actually hear the lead sequence going through channel 1 and then the bass sequence going through channels 7 and 8, like this. So that's the bass in stereo going into the console. But you're not hearing the bass in stereo, and that's because the pan settings for the two channels, 7 and 8, are set vertically. So at the moment, even though it's receiving a stereo output from the wave and the filter, you're hearing two mono channels. So to get the proper stereo effect as coming out from the wave and the F35, you need to pan the channels, the left channel hard left and the right channel hard right, and then you'll get the correct stereo image as being sent from the wave and the F35, like this. Oh, and if you're not listening to this through good stereo speakers or a pair of stereo headphones, I recommend you do so you can hear the stereo panning effects and everything else correctly. You probably won't hear them if you're listening to little speakers built into a laptop or a computer. So there's the mono left and right, and now I'm going to pan and you'll hear the stereo image take place. And now that bass sound is spread across the stereo image instead of being focused dead center, which gives it a much fatter, wider sound. Again, if I reset these to the mono positions, then everything's focused dead center, but you're not getting any of that stereo panning. If I turn them hard left and hard right, you'll get the image again. Now I'm going to turn on the phaser effect by adding some send A to both the left and the right channels. Now you can hear the phaser effect. And then I'm going to add a little bit of reverb. And remember, this is a master reverb, so I'll add reverb to both channel 7 and 8 and to channel 1. And if I turn off the original signal for channel 1, all you'll hear is the affected signal for channel 1. And turn it back on again. And the same with the bass. So now all you're hearing is the signal as it passes through the stereo phaser, then through the reverb, and then out to my audio. Now I've turned on the original signal again to give that extra depth to the signal. So that's how you add a stereo channel to a mixer. You take two channels and you pan hard left and hard right to retain that stereo image. Now, the next thing I want to look at is all these patch points, because this is where the console really shines. Lots of other mixers have similar capabilities in terms of inputs and solos and mute buttons. Some have send and returns, not many, I have to be honest with you, but there are a couple out there that do. But not so many have all these different patch points. And these patch points allow you to control the level of whatever these patch points are connected to. So, for example, LV, this is the patch point that determines the volume level for that channel. So if you take an input here and connect it to, say, an LFO like this, and I'm going to slow the LFO down, then what this will do is slowly turn up and turn down the volume for channel 1. So it will vary over time, like this. You could hear the volume increasing, decreasing in time with the LFO here. Now, a quick tip here is if you use a BPM LFO, in other words, an LFO whose cycles can be tied to the speed of a clock, and you know there are many of these out there, but Frozen Wastelands is probably the best one that I know of, their BPM LFO, then you can actually time the increases and decreases in volume to the sequence patterns that are locked to the same clock. So you could say time an increase and a decrease over 8 bars, rather than just be something random that happens out of sync with the rest of the piece. So that's an important little tip, and one that you should pay attention to, because that can generate some very interesting time synchronized effects. So now I'm going to show you the next bit, which is I'm going to take this output, instead of going into the level, I'm going to put it into the pan input. And what I'm going to do is turn the pan control for that channel hard left. So what the LFO will do is pan the sound from the left to the right and then back to the left in time with the speed of the LFO. So it will sound something like this. And there, if you're using headphones or good speakers, you'll hear the sound traveling from left to right and back to left in time with this LFO. And the reason why I pan this hard left is so that the signal travels across the entire stereo spectrum. If I left this in the center, then it will pan hard to the right but not go anywhere to the left, because that's the starting position for the pan. So now you should be able to hear it going to the middle and then going to the right. So to make it do the full travel, turn the pan knob hard to the left, and now the signal will pan all the way over. There is another way of doing this, and that is to leave this in the central position but change the LFO from 90 degrees to 180 and change the send to what's called the bipolar mode instead of the unipolar, and then the signal will also go hard left and hard right from a central. But not every LFO has that capability, so I tend to stick to using it in unipolar mode and then hard panning to the left to get the full stereo effect. Okay, so that's how you pan left and right and how you change volume left and right. And of course you can take another LFO and put that into the into the LV input, change the rate, and now you'll get both panning and volume changes for that channel happening in sync with these two LFOs, like this. because these two LFOs are running at different speeds, the level and the pan will happen at different times, giving a constantly moving soundscape that's constantly varying. Sometimes you'll hear it loud on the right, in the center, or on the left. Sometimes you won't. It's entirely how these two LFOs interact with each other. And again, if you're using a BPM locked LFO, you could determine that exactly to happen in time with certain beats or certain parts of the music. Okay, so that's panning and volume changes. But we've got some other patch points here I want to show you. So I'm going to show you now how to use the solo and the mute buttons to manually or automate turning on and off voices. And to do that, I'm going to do a manual version. I'm going to use a switch. And the switch I'm going to use is the one from AS, which is called Triggers Mark II. And here is the Triggers Mark II switch. And I'm going to take the output from that switch and put it into the mute input for channel 1. And I'm going to set up a label, and I'll call this one, I don't know, we'll call it lead 1 part, just to remind me what it actually is. And now when I play the song, if I press this button, this will automatically mute this channel to silence it. And then I can press it again to unmute it. So that's a way of muting one channel. However, one of the tricks you can use if you need to mute more than one channel is hold down on a Mac, it's the command key, and I believe it's the control key on Windows. Hold it down and take another output like this and feed it to the mute channel for the channel you want to mute. And I'm going to take another one here and add that. So now when I press this button, it will mute both channels 1 and channels 7, 8 at the same time, like this. And then press it again to unmute. Now there's another trick you can do with this, and I'm going to use an LFO to do this, but you can use a pulse sequencer or anything that sends a gate. And what I'm going to do is take an output from the square wave output of an LFO, this one here for example, and feed it to the external input on Triggers Mark II. And what this will do is it will automate when this button is turned on and off in speed with the LFO. And you can get gating effects. Or you can, with a BPM clocked LFO, you can turn a particular set of tracks or individual track on and off in synchro with the clock, so you can determine when a part can be heard and when it can't be heard in relation to the rest of the piece. Or you could use a trigger sequencer to turn the parts on and off in time with the piece. just feed the output from the trigger into the external input here. Take your outputs and feed them to whichever mutes you want, and the piece will turn itself on and off in time with the rest of your music. Like that. Just came on because that's when the oscillator, when the LFO reached its signal to turn on the pulse from the square wave LFO. And when it drops down low enough, it will turn itself off automatically without me doing anything. Like that. So that's how you can automate parts of your mix on and off in time with the music or at random. And again, the LFOs here that's driving the pan and the level, they will work independently of this. So you can get, again, all sorts of different possibilities and functionalities coming from it. The same applies to the solo inputs here. Now, to let you hear what solo does, let me turn on all the parts. And if I manually press the 0 here, this will turn off every other channel except the one that I've clicked on, like this. Notice it turned off the bass part completely. So here I've soloed just the lead sequencer part. If I click it again, the bass part will come in. And here, if I click the solo buttons for the left and right channels, that will only let you hear the left and right channels of the bass, and the sequence line will disappear. So now you're just hearing the left-hand channel of the bass. And if I solo this one as well, now you'll hear both left and right, but you won't hear the sequencer or anything else that I was feeding into channels 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. And unsolo them, and now all the pieces come back together again. And again, you can use a trigger sequencer or an LFO or a BPM'd LFO or anything else that sends a gate into these inputs here to achieve that same effect. Now, one of the questions I get asked is, well, say I wanted to reduce the volume level of a stereo pair. How do I do that? Because if I try and do it with a mouse, I can only move one channel at a time, like this. And then I have to pull this one down to balance them up. So what you end up is one side being reduced in volume and then the other side. You can't do both together. Well, there's a trick to this too. And again, for this example, I'm going to use another of AS's modules, but this case, Triggers Mark 1, not the Triggers Mark 2. So let me pull up a Triggers Mark 1 and show you. So here is Triggers Mark 1. And Triggers Mark 1 has two buttons, and I'm going to use the latch button in this instance. And it's got a voltage knob. See this? I can rotate the voltage coming out of the output here from 0 to 10, which is basically the range of voltage that these inputs will take, for example, for the level control. So now what I'm going to do is remove the LFO, and I'm going to take the input here for the level and feed that to the output from triggers. And again, holding down the modifier key, take another chord from the output and put that to the other level control, like this. So now when I play the piece and I turn on the latch to make sure the voltage is being sent, now when I play the piece, there's no bass volume. until I rotate this volts knob like this. Now both channels are their volume is being changed at the speed at which I turn this volts value. So I can do a slow or fast or whatever I want volume change just by rotating one knob, but it's affecting two channels at the same time. And if I took the level output from here and fed that in as well, now I can change the volume level for all three parts, the left and right bass, and in this case the volume for the lead synth. You can also do other effects with this as well. Just by turning the latch off, this instantly cuts the tracks but allows the echoes to keep playing in the background like this. And then turn them back on again. And if you've watched any of my other demos and stuff I've done in Talking Racks, you'll know I use Triggers Mark 1 and Triggers Mark 2 to perform pieces live, because I use these, multiples of these, to control mixing, to control balances, to turn parts on and off, and I can do that all manually whilst I'm wiggling live to be able to create these sort of wonderful stereo mixes and effects coming on and off and channels coming on and off to produce an entire piece from all the various complex parts that I use. There is another way of controlling the volume, and that is to take the outputs from the Triggers Mark 1, turn the volume down to 0 here, and then this knob becomes the master volume for the whole system, which is the same as rotating this one. But sometimes the mixer is off screen or in a different part of the screen, and what I tend to do is put all my triggers together so I've got them in one place, so I'm not constantly whipping my mouse around all over the place to do things. I can control everything from one basic area of the screen. So I can mute and unmute and volume change like this. And if I take away the mute from the lead and press this button, now I can just hear the lead by itself. And again, control the volume, master volume here. And turn on the bass again, like this. And again, I can mute the whole thing because I'm turning off the volume using the master control, but notice this time when I turn it off, it mutes everything, including the echoes. So this is like a hard mute. There's no reverb, there's no delays going on afterwards, like there was when I took this and used these volume controls over here, like this. I'll turn the master volume up. Now if I use this, you can hear those echoes continuing afterwards. So how you wire this up and how you use it is important, as it can do all sorts of things. And again, this sort of control can also be used to change the levels of the effect senders and returns. You could set up a Triggers Mark 1 to control those from a single knob, and you could set up both if you wanted to, coming from the same controller. Or you could use this to set up levels here. Instead of rotating this little knob here, you could use a Triggers Mark 1 or an LFO or anything else that generates a random signal to change the levels of an effect over time. So for example, you could have, and we'll do this, I'm going to take these out and I'm going to use the Mark 1 trigger to change the level of the send for the lead synth's echo part. Turn this one down a little bit. So there is no delay going on. And as I turn this knob, that turns the delay more and more and more and more. But I can also use this button here to turn the effect on and off. And to demonstrate how you could use a trigger sequencer to affect things, I've added one of the VCV pulse matrices here. This is the 8-step one. And what I've done is I've connected the output from the first channel here to the external input of the triggers. And so triggers is turning on and off the amount of delays that are going on, and I've set this up so that it'll turn the delay on for 4 beats and then turn them off for 4 beats and turn on for 4 beats and turn off for 4 beats, so you'll get this sort of effect. Of course, you can set up the turn on and turn off effects in time with the music in different ways. For example, I'll have it turn on and off every 2 beats. Or I could do it every 3. So what this does and what this allows for is you to sequence effects, turning effects on and off in time with your piece. And these could be any effects that you're using or any parts. You could use, for example, the flow control from AS to turn on the flow of CV signals to a particular module. So you can turn that on and off whenever you want to. Or use a switch and have it flow one direction for X number of beats and another. But with the console, this is how you can use it to sequence effects that are fed in through the send and returns. So you can get some very good and interesting effect-based sequences going that mean that your effect is not playing all the time, but only comes in when you want it to. For example, a lot of reverb on the first hit of a snare drum, but off for the rest. You could sequence that up using a pulse matrix, or again, anything that sends a trigger that you can sequence or manually control with a button. And through the triggers Mark 1 connected to the input here, the control input for either the A send or the B send, get that effect out of the system. So that's how a mixer works. It's a simple thing, but actually gives a lot of variety and a lot of interesting and complex things you can do with it, even though it may not seem it on the surface. But a mixer like the console or any of the others are out there have similar capabilities and functionality. It becomes an integral part of any piece, because you can sequence the mixer just like you sequence notes, like you sequence gates, like you sequence rhythmic patterns. The same applies to the console. You can sequence things up. You can do gated volumes, gated pans. You can do sequenced effects. You can do sequenced mutes. Whatever you want to do, that's what you use a mixer for. Okay, well, I hope you found that interesting, and I know a lot of you have been asking me about mixers and how to use them, so I hope that gives you some better insight. And experiment away and see what you can come up with, and have a great time. Thanks, guys. And now it's time for another patch breakdown. And this patch is based on a patch that I used as some playout music in a couple of TR episodes ago. And what I've done is I've expanded upon it and added a few new little tweaks to it, and also I've updated it for 0.6, so it uses a few of the new updated modules that were updated, and little features were changed or added in those modules when VCV Rack itself was updated. So let's have a look at the basic layout of this patch. I'm using my default setup of a BPM clock, the VCV console, an XFX reverb from Blamsoft, 2 delay plus FXs from AS, and the audio interface, one of the basic core modules. And what I've done is, as always, I've set up the reverb and the delays coming into the send and returns on the VCV console, so I can allocate certain amounts of reverb and delay to certain voices, and I can have different amounts sent to different voices. Then the next thing I've done is I've taken one of the Turing machines, and this is one of my favorite modules, as most of you will know if you've watched any of my other episodes, for generating random pitches and random gates. And I'm using both of its outputs, output 1 and output 2 here, to drive 2 quantum quantizers. And the quantum quantizer I've covered in the past. This is the version where you select which notes from a scale the quantizer will lock notes to, lock pitches to. So this allows you to define your own scales or certain pitches that you only want to be played by a certain module. This also allows, of course, you to do this in such a way that things become musically related and interconnected. Then I'm using a couple of XFX wave modules, again one of my favorite oscillator modules for playing 2 synth parts, and I've got an XFX F35 filter module for each, and a couple of volt slap modules, which I'm using to generate dual envelopes because these are stereo devices and I want to keep the sound in stereo, so I'm using 2 of them per voice going out to the mixer, panned left and right. I'm also using a couple of BPM LFOs to do BPM synced modulation on the waveform shape, and in this case also adding a bit of mirror sync as a modulation, and this one just modulating the waveform. And I'm using the couple of the modern, like this is the modern Vosin and this is the modern Chatty waveforms to create these sounds. So let's have a look at what each of those sounds like at the moment. So this is the first voice, the modern Vosin based one. and I sort of wanted to go for, I don't know, pretty type sounds in this particular one. So I chose that waveform, did a bit of modulation. You can hear the sound evolving over time as it's playing. And now I'll add in the second part, which is coming from the second output of this Turing machine. Now, one of the tricks that I did here is you'll notice I'm using 4 different random triggers from the Turing machine. And one of the fixes that they did when they updated this module to 0.6 is that they corrected the behavior of these extra gate outputs. On the original hardware, when this gate and this gate were triggered at the same time, then you get a trigger from here. On the original version, instead of ANDing it, they did it as an OR. So whenever a gate was received here or here, this would light up. So this meant this sent a trigger or a gate much more often than in the hardware version would. So what they've done is actually provided an option here. This is the behavior that was originally programmed, and this is the behavior that accurately reflects the hardware version of the Turing machine. And so I've selected the AND version here for this module. So what I've then done is taken the gate, this gate, and fed it to the first envelope, and taken this gate and fed it to this envelope down here. Then taken this gate and fed it to the second envelope, and this one to this envelope. So what this actually does is gives a different gated trigger to the left and right stereo outputs that I'm feeding into the mixer. So sometimes you'll get the sound coming out of the left channel, sometimes out of the right, and it's purely random based on these gates. Okay, so that's the 2 sort of pretty sequence lines that I've got set up. Then I've added to that another Turing machine and another 2 voices. This time I'm using the KoralFX, which is from South Pole, which is based on the Braids hardware from Musical Instruments. And I love this module because it's got some really authentic sounding synth waveforms in it. And the one I'm using here is the Seesaw, which is basically the CS80 waveform by Yamaha. And it's got that rich, deep, fat, sort of synthy waveform sound that the CS80 was famous for. And I've taken 2 of these modules, and I've taken one output from the Turing machine, fed it into a Quantum, fed it into one of 2 of the Bog Audio stacks. These are the modules that let you set individual semitone tuning and octave tuning for a voice, and then fed the output of that into the volt per octave input of a cornrow. But what I've also done is taken another output from the Quantum and fed that into the second Bog Audio stack, and taken that volt per octave and fed it into this KoralFX. But I've also tuned this one to be 7 semitones, or in other words, a fifth, higher than this one. I've also set the octave range up 1 higher octave. So in reality, this voice will be playing 1.5 octaves higher than this one. Same note, but this will be transposed 1.5 octaves higher. Then I fed that, each of these KoralFXs, into another F35 filter, and again into 2 envelopes, because I want these to trigger differently to each other. And the same for the first voice here, and then out into stereo into my mixer. And these tracks sound together like this. So that's the first voice. Now I'll add the second one. And that gives a nice sort of like rich, deep, synthy tone to the piece. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is play the entire piece for you. It's only a short piece. It basically plays forever, so this is just an excerpt. But I want to show you how these sort of things interact together and produce some nice music. You know, I'm not saying it's the best music in the world, but it is relaxing. It's pretty, I suppose, and it's actually musically relatable to each other. So again, this is this method of using the Turing machines, which generate random stuff to then create musical and musically sounding patches. And it sounds something like this. And there you go. Again, just an excerpt from it. I'll be including this patch along with all the other patches I can from this episode of Talking Rackheads, so you can play and experiment with this yourself. And you noticed while I was performing that, I'm using the lock command on the Turing machine to create looped sequences that repeat over and over again until I unlock them. And that's a great way of taking snapshots of something while you're playing. You hear something that one of these modules produces, quickly whip the knob round to the right, and it will keep repeating that over and over again, depending on the loop length you've set here. If you want to know more about the Turing machine, check out one of my earlier episodes of Talking Rackheads. I did an entire piece on the Turing Machine. It is a wonderful module for musical inspiration of ideas and just random and semi-random stuff. And I get a lot of fun out of playing with this. Both the software version in VCV Rack and the hardware version in my Euro Rack. Okay, well, hope you enjoyed that. And again, hopefully there'll be more of these patch breakdowns in the future, as it's something a lot of people have been requesting, and so, hey, I'll give it a go. Thanks, guys. And that brings us to the end of episode 7. To play us out today, well, Freddie from AS asked me if I would put together a patch that uses only his modules. And I thought that's quite a challenge because I never tried to do that before. So this is a work in progress. This isn't finished yet, but this is sort of like an excerpt from how this is going, using just modules by AS. Hope you enjoy it. See you next week. Stay safe, my friends. Bye.